Thank you very much, Paul. And just to really echo the welcome to those of you who are not at the summer school but visiting us this evening, you're all very welcome. As Paul said, the summer school is a very important activity for us at INCORE. It's been going on now for 13 years, so this is our 1347 participants from 15 countries. So it always attracts a very diverse audience, and it's a time where we get to share some of the learning from here, but a time where we also learn an enormous amount from people from around the world. So it's great to have people from the city and from the summer school all here together. It's a good time for INCORE at the moment. There is a very strong emphasis on developing peace and conflict studies on the McGee campus. We have a very strong and full research agenda, a number of really strong programs developing through ARC and through CANE, and the launch of a new revamped MSc in Applied Peace and Conflict Studies. So we're feeling very confident and happy about the years to come, and we're very glad that you're all here to share a little bit of that with us this evening. My job this evening is to introduce Roger, who we are delighted to have over with us. However, before I do that, I wanted to begin the proceedings this evening by taking the opportunity to express our deep regret and recent passing of Professor John Darby, who was the founding director of INCORE. John was an international scholar with vision and commitment to the field of peace and conflict studies. And he first established the Center for the Study of Conflict at the University of Ulster, which focused on the Northern Ireland conflict, but then developed the concept of an international center where we could learn from the experiences elsewhere and also share some of the experiences from Northern Ireland. And in so doing, the vision was that we could contribute to conflict transformation both here and in other societies. And I think that John helped make that come true. It is true to say that without John's vision, scholarly leadership, and international networks, INCORE would not have been the foundation on which much of its work is founded today, and some of the very positive things that I've just mentioned in terms of our future. It is particularly poignant that this year's lecture is given by Professor Roger McGinty, who was one of John's first researchers and then went on to publish extensively with John. He was also a close and dear friend of John's. So we feel it's really fitting that you are with us, Roger, this evening. So I just really wanted to begin in that way because I think that the foundations of institutions are important, and not only the personal loss for many of us of John. I think his vision has been critical, and what will be developing more and more at INCORE is rooted in individuals like John. So to move on to the lecture, Roger McGinty is a native of Northern Ireland and a professor of peace and conflict studies at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute at the Department of Politics at the University of Manchester. Prior to this, Roger was at St. Andrews, and before that at the unit in York University. However, we like to claim him as one of our own. I believe his first academic post was here at INCORE in the late 1990s when he first came to work with John Darby on peace processes. And with John and other colleagues, Roger has been at the forefront of research into comparative peace processes. He has retained the links with us, and most recently was the external examiner on the MA in Peace and Conflict Studies. And it's really a tremendous pleasure for us to have him with us this evening, and also since his recent appointment as a chair at Manchester University. His latest book is on international peace building, is entitled International Peace Building and Local Resistance, Hybrid Forms of Peacemaking, and was published in 2011. He edits a book series, Political Violence, and the journal called Peace Building. He's currently working on an EU Framework 7 project entitled Cultures of Governance and Conflict Resolution in the European Union and India. So I certainly look forward immensely to hear Roger's talk this evening, and the talk is enticingly entitled Everyday Diplomacy. So Roger.
Thank you, Brandon and Paul. I do have a great affection for INCORE. I had my first academic job here and retain great affection. So solicitations to everyone who's on the summer school. Let's hope that you get summer as well in terms of weather. I want to begin by mentioning, as Brandon did, John Darby. John was, as Brandon pointed out, my first employer. He was an incredibly sophisticated thinker without any sophistry. Academia is full of large egos, and very often behind that ego is great insecurity. John just didn't bother with ego. He was immensely humble. He was, as Brandon says, a comparativist. The study of Northern Ireland wasn't enough for him. He was anxious to learn what lessons could be derived from other contexts. John had an immense sense of humor. He suffered in his latter years from motor neuron disease, and one of the symptoms of that was that he lost the power of speech. This time last year, I went to visit him and his wife in Portstewart, about 30 miles away. And before my visit, I emailed John just to say I was coming, and he sent me a reply. And it said, "Roger, I don't want you to think that me not speaking to you has anything to do with my condition. It's a protracted huff." So he was hugely funny, but he was a wonderful mentor, incredibly generous in helping a generation of scholars behind him, encouraging them. Okay, so I want to talk about everyday diplomacy. And I want to begin in an oddly Freudian way with my parents. My parents were expert diplomats. They didn't go to diplomatic school. They weren't trained formally as diplomats. But like millions of other people in deeply divided societies, they deployed everyday diplomacy. They used the skills of tact and common sense to navigate their way through everyday life. I want to suggest in this lecture that we concentrate too much on experts. In a sense, there is the tyranny of the expert, the lab-coated, pointy-headed academic. Now, you've got an academic talking at you for the next 40 minutes, so I realize that in this lecture, I'm going to be on thin ice. But I feel that we concentrate too much on conflict resolution expertise and experts, and as a consequence, overlook everyday diplomacy from so-called ordinary people. Now, I want to be really careful not to romanticize the local. I'm not dreaming up of smock-wearing, wheat-stalk-chewing rustics. Deeply divided societies are divided for a reason, and it takes human agency, and people, individuals, and groups are involved in stoking and maintaining conflict. Yet the conflict calming potential of everyday diplomacy, I suggest, risks being overlooked. And I want to argue that it might contain enough bridging social capital to prevent some societies from tipping from situations of tension and low-level conflict into situations of violence. Now, in the first part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about technocracy and bureaucracy. And you're probably thinking, it's a rather nice summer's evening. He isn't really going to spend 20 minutes talking about bureaucracy. I am. Because I think it's really important, and I want to explain why it's important in terms of peace building. And then I want to conceptualize what I mean by everyday peace building. Everyday diplomacy. So let me start with technocracy. and boring things like paper clips and systems of filing and the tech guy and the filing cabinet and all of that. Because I think that peace building has experienced a technocratic turn over the past 2 decades. There has been the rise of the bureaucratic imperative. Technocracy is the prioritization of bureaucracy, bureaucratic systems taking over. And the peace-building sector is in no way immune or in no way unusual from this technocratic rise. We've seen it in virtually every other sector, and I'm sure Dean Carmichael suffers greatly and possibly makes others suffer as well, but through the rise of technocracy in universities and more generally, we can see it in the third sector. Now, technocracy in one way is liberating because it offers a policy paradigm that is rational, that's based on scientific evidence. We can see how the advantages for peace building and the advantages for peace building through the use of technocracy can be clear. Value-free decision making. It offers to depoliticize contentious decisions that might be based on subjective or arbitrary or discriminatory criteria. We know that many of the explanations for violent conflict say that conflict is due to a lack of transparency. It's due to a lack of clear communication. Well, technocracy is able to cut through that. It offers transparent, routine, predictable ways in which decisions are made and resources are shared. And we can all see the advantage of that in deeply divided societies. And we have seen administrative rationality actually calming conflicts. Places, situations in which there are tribunals, commissions of inquiry, truth and reconciliation commissions. So I'm not arguing against technocracy per se, but what I want to do is to highlight some of the problems associated with technocracy. First of all, I think it's a mistake to see it as being neutral and value-free. We have to place it within its own specific political and ideological context. Technocratic elites rely on material power. Technocrats assume a particular worldview, a worldview that sees technocratic methods and solutions as being superior, and as a result, they discount alternatives. The Canadian academic Tim Donas notes, in the technocratic version of peace building, local perspectives are more often viewed as hurdles, spelt wrong, to be overcome or obstacles to be avoided than as potential sources of sustainable solutions. The problem with exclusive approaches to peace building is that they crowd out alternatives. There's a danger of epistemic closure in which technocratic actors analyze the conflict in technocratic ways and they recommend technocratic solutions. You're probably sitting there thinking, if that guy mentions the word technocratic again, I'm going to swing for him. I share your pain, but let me explain why I think this is so incredibly important. We can see moves by international organizations to standardize the conflict analysis frameworks that they use to interpret, describe, and define conflicts. We can see the UN developing a framework for a common contextual analysis for the causes of conflict. A number of NGOs have joined in a consortium to standardize the conflict analysis frameworks in use. We can see the identification and the collation of best practice. Now, of course, this isn't problematic in itself, but if these best practice conflict analysis regimes become unreflexive, if they become mechanistic, then there are problems. The essential point is that the framing of conflict shapes how conflict is understood, discussed, and responded to. Imagine you're in the Democratic Republic of Congo, a rural area. The state is irrelevant. The state, you don't see it. Maybe a patrol car comes, a 4x4, once a fortnight. The main sources of power and legitimacy are your family, your extended kin, possibly church networks, and crucially, trading networks. From an NGO based in the global north, a conflict analysis team arrive with the latest theories. The problem they immediately diagnose is a lack of statehood. The problem is there is no state here. And the way we can get certainty and good governance and stamp out corruption and stamp out conflict is to build the state. And if you're coming from the global north, in which states are generally pretty effective, in which they provide security and basic services, that makes perfect sense. But what those conflict analyzers are doing is actually imposing a technocratic worldview on other people who are sort of wondering, my conflict is actually because there isn't a state? Well, the state comes every 2 weeks, or a tax collector comes every 6 months. You know, frankly, the state has never given me anything. I've lived without it. I don't need your state. Please go away. And these clashing worldviews are underpinned by immense power. Legitimacy from the bottom up, but material power of aid, of security from the top down. So we see this identification of best practice, this standardization, also important in the technocratic turn that peacebuilding has experienced, is the emergence of a professionalized cadre of peacebuilders. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, well, hang on, I'm paying to spend a week at INCORE to find out best practice on peacebuilding. You might think the guy standing in front of you is in a hole and digging. Well, you're right, I am, but that's what I do best. Because I have also contributed to this professionalization of the peacebuilding sector. I've convened a number of MA programs. I'm putting another one together. What we've seen in recent years is a significant growth in the numbers of courses, handbooks, toolkits concerned with peacebuilding. Now, the sector has not yet adopted the equivalent of the widely agreed sphere standards that we see in the humanitarian sector, but that might just be a matter of time. The UN has recently developed benchmarks for peace consolidation. It's attempted to institutionalize best practice through its UN Peacekeeping Resource Hub. In fact, these terms, best practice and lessons learned, have become the ubiquitous cliches that stalk the peacebuilding community. What I'm doing here is pointing to a professionalized peacebuilding sector that favors particular types of interventions, that often favor technocratic solutions to problems, a preferred set of analysis and a preferred set of interventions. Problems arise when this is unreflexive, when it doesn't take local contexts into account. My intention isn't to launch a broadside against the peacebuilding sector. I'm part of it we're all part of it. Nor is it to launch a broadside against bureaucracy per se. I like my paycheck and would be first in the complaints queue if I didn't get it. Instead, I'm criticizing an unthinking technocracy or bureaucratic imperative that overvalues experts and undervalues local approaches to making and maintaining peace. A technocratic discourse can strip people of agency. When you think about it, violent conflict de-skills and de-powers people. It takes away their security, their livelihood, their ability to pursue education, etc. And another indignity that people in conflict areas often suffer from is that outsiders define their conflict for them. And that's actually stripping agency from people in conflict areas. Okay, so having bored you rigid by mentioning technocracy as often as I could, it can only get better, you think. Well, I'm going into the territory of poetry. And this is coming from someone who really has read about 2 poems in their life. I really just don't get poetry, so bear with me. There's a certain inevitability of someone who's giving a public lecture in Northern Ireland that they quote from Nobel Prize-winning poet Seamus Heaney. And that's what I'm about to do. Now, it might be a symptom of an early midlife crisis, but I read the poem that I'm going to cite from, and it really, really did mean something. I thought it was superb. Now, in 1975, Heaney published a collection of poems, and included in that was the work entitled Whatever You Say, Say Nothing. Now, 1975 was a particularly grim year in Northern Ireland. 258 people lost their lives in the Troubles, the majority of them civilians. By 1975, people in Northern Ireland had already seen Bloody Friday, Bloody Sunday, internment, serial political failure and crisis, and the daily drip of murders and bombings and outrages. People developed very sophisticated methods to continue living, to ease their passage through a deeply divided society. And these methods, I think, are well encapsulated in Heaney's poem, Whatever You Say, Say Nothing. I'm not going to read out the poem. There are just certain sentences or lines that I thought were particularly good. He mentions expertly civil-tongued with civil neighbours, sucking the fake taste, the stony flavours of those sanctioned old elaborate retorts. Oh, it's disgraceful. Surely, I agree. Where's it going to end? It's getting worse. Religion's never mentioned here, of course. You know them by their eyes, and hold your tongue. Northern reticence, the tight gag of place. Whatever you say, say nothing. Smoke signals are loud-mouthed compared to us. O land of password, hand grip, wink, and nod, of open minds as open as a trap, where tongues lie coiled as under flames lie wicks, where half of us, as in a wooden horse, were cabined and confined like wily Greeks, besieged within the siege, whispering Morse. As I say, I don't really get poetry, but I get a number of phrases here that really speak to me in terms of everyday coping mechanisms deployed by people to navigate their way through life in a deeply divided society. And I want to unpack and conceptualize what some of these conflict retarding and avoiding methods might be. I'm particularly interested in deeply divided societies in which people of opposing communities have proximity to one another. They rub alongside each other. They live nearby. They work nearby. So I'm not talking about places like Georgia and Abkhazia or Israel, Palestine, where there is quite a lot of formal physical separation between groups. Instead, places like here, like the Basque Country, like Lebanon and others, in which people live in close proximity to one another, but hold different identities, different religious or political views. And this getting used to conflict was neatly summed up in John Darby's professorial lecture, which had the arresting title, Whatever You Say, it had the arresting title, What's Wrong with Conflict? And John mentioned an anecdote in this. He said, some years ago I was forcibly struck by how much we have come to take abnormality, in other words, political violence, for granted. I was showing a French television team through West Belfast when an army patrol, armed to the teeth, rushed out of Fort Mona on a regular patrol. They took position beside the crew, spread-eagled on the ground, covering each other. As the Swedish cameraman was reaching a point of orgasmic excitement filming this, two old ladies, shopping bags in hand, came walking along the pavement without interrupting their conversation. Without interrupting their conversation, they carefully picked their way over the recumbent soldier and continued towards the shops. I am convinced they did not even see him. So I'm actually interested in this, how we come to not notice conflict, or how we come to regard it as part of the furniture, as part of the everyday. I'm not going to talk about something I've researched and written about elsewhere, and that is the formal, ritualized, customary, indigenous, and traditional peacemaking techniques that we can find. Instead, I'm talking about actions and speech that is so deeply embedded in everyday life that it's actually very difficult to notice. And when one goes through the academic and policy literature, and we look at the factors that retard conflict or calm violent conflict, well, the everyday diplomacy tends not to be mentioned. Instead, we see factors such as intervention by national and international security forces. So, for example, a UN monitoring or peacekeeping force. Or we see political initiatives. For example, the introduction of power sharing or a tribunal to look at a grievance. Or one factor that might limit violent conflict is simply a lack of capacity or opportunity among combatants. An offensive runs out of steam. The weather gets in the way of a military offensive. And very often we see a division of labour among combatants and their support communities, where it's only the young men who engage in the frontline activities and others engage in support activity. Or the opportunity cost of engaging in violence is quite high. Imprisonment, unemployment, family stigma, etc., or indeed death or injury. But I'm interested in the last one of these, that's everyday individual and group actions that avoid conflict. I want to make 3 points to try and conceptualize what I mean by everyday peace building. The first point is that I want to underline the agency of individuals and groups. Clearly, the level of agency, the freedom of action, is going to vary from context to context according to the security situation. In some contexts, there's very strict community policing, intra-group policing. There's a marvelous autobiography by Christina Bielenberg called The Past is Myself, in which she recounts she recounts her early married years in Nazi Germany in the late 1930s and then into the war, when she couldn't trust her neighbours. She couldn't trust her children because they were playing with kids who were members of the Hitler Youth or would talk to their parents. But situations of extreme gatekeeping are actually quite uncommon, I would suggest. People find multiple ways to express agency. The thing about it is that outside observers often are very poorly placed to see this local agency. They cannot see what James Scott calls the hidden transcript. Very often, as social scientists or those working in the policy world or the media world, we're actually quite good at seeing the public transcript. But all individuals and all societies also have a hidden transcript, a transcript that takes place behind closed doors, or only amongst locals, or only when one member leaves the group that is chatting. Very often, particularly outsiders, have very simplistic views of communities undergoing conflict. They tend to see them in rather cartoonesque or caricature ways. In fact, our view of Afghanistan, I think, illustrates this very well. As far as I can work out from the news media, there are two sorts of Afghans: those that support the Taliban and those that support Karzai. And there's absolutely nothing in between. I would suggest that there are about 3 people who support the Taliban and 1.5 people on a good day who support Karzai, and everybody else is in between. And what I'm suggesting is that contemporary social science, despite being the science of the study of humanity, has actually de-skilled many of us to see this hidden transcript that anthropologists are actually quite skilled at seeing, but many political scientists or international relations people like myself are actually quite poor at seeing. But my chief point here is that people find multiple ways of expressing individuality, of expressing dissent, of getting beyond the two positions that we tend to see in the media, which are compliance on the one hand and resistance on the other. My second point of conceptualization is that everyday diplomacy operates at both the inter and the intra group level. Indeed, because of ethnic geography, because of the proximity of living patterns, it's at the intra-group level that individuals and families are often required to use their everyday diplomacy. Despite depictions of homogeneity, communities in deeply divided societies tend to be quite divided within groups. There are many subdivisions. Individuals, families, and subgroups engage in constant processes of social identification and social categorization, in which they position themselves according to their peers, they position themselves according to the in-group and the out-group. In a deeply divided society, the space for dissent might be narrow, but opinions and stances are unlikely to be uniform. Again, this depends heavily on the context, whether there is latitude for dissent. I remember being in Sri Lanka some years ago, in Jaffna in the northeast, talking to a room of people who were 100% behind the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers. And I was trying to explain the notion of spoilers and how not everyone from the Tamil community would support the Tamil Tigers. And they said to me, but that's ridiculous. Don't be silly. Of course all Tamils support the Tamil Tigers. And they just couldn't get it, or else in public they didn't want to get it. One of the reasons the Tamil Tigers were crushed by the Sri Lankan government was because of spoilers, because of a major defection from their ranks. Yet in public, this couldn't be admitted to. The notion of defection could not be spoken about. Not only because of issues of social acceptability, but also because of security. The Tamil Tigers had a dreadful reputation of killing people from their own camp who stepped out of turn. My third conceptualizing point of everyday diplomacy is to highlight the dissembling capacity of individuals. In other words, we can say one thing but mean another. I think this is a fantastic human skill. I think it should be celebrated. It's not lying. I think it is a wonderful piece of diplomacy. And again, this goes back to James C. Scott's notion of the hidden transcript. The transcript that takes place when you leave the room, when you're not present. The form that is submitted, and you only read what you're meant to read, but you don't hear the expletives that were uttered when the person was filling in that form. So individuals can be wonderfully dissembling. They can publicly endorse an accepted transcript, but behind closed doors, the transcript might be one of dissent and resistance. Again, this speaks of agency. It speaks of communities and individuals being in 3D rather than as caricatures. People can simultaneously hold multiple positions and are skilled enough when particular stances are appropriate or inappropriate. So what are some of these everyday diplomacy skills? Well, they include saying nothing, as Seamus Heaney said. Only in the Heaney version, people said a lot, but they didn't say very much. So they talked about the weather or inconsequential things, but they didn't talk about the elephant in the room. Dissembling in words and actions, telling people one audience one thing, but thinking another. Avoiding contentious topics if in, for example, mixed religious or mixed identity group company. Avoiding engaging in displays and rituals and practices that might be offensive. Parents sanitizing narratives to their children, and that certainly happened to me growing up, in which my parents didn't sit me down in the early 1970s and say, listen, you're living in a really horrible place. There's been 2 murders, there's been a bombing, and the roads are closed. They told me that, in a sense, they told me a complete fiction, a sanitized version of what was going on and history. And I'm grateful for that. Now, the precise repertoire of everyday diplomacy will obviously differ between individuals and context, and it will vary over time. Now, it's possible to critique this everyday diplomacy. It's possible to say, hang on, this is just conflict avoidance. This isn't conflict transformation. That might be true, but in many contexts, only conflict avoidance is possible. It takes a hell of a lot of bravery to engage in conflict transformation, and frankly, it might be madness to attempt to carry it out. Nor should we underestimate how actions like this can actually minimize conflict. It's the dog that didn't bark, so it's very difficult to see, difficult to measure. But it, I suggest, has an enormous capacity to retard conflict escalation. When seen in aggregate, everyday civility in deeply divided societies can be an important glue, an important part of social capital that holds the society together, that prevents it reaching the tipping point. The generalized norms of interaction that people carry out every day tend to be quite self-interested, quite rational. Individuals engage in very carefully prescribed rituals when they meet each other, when they meet people from the other group. And often this is entirely rational. It's to protect themselves from harm. I think, though, we should avoid moral judgments on activities like this. We could see them as being a piece of duplicity, but I don't see it that way, because they're usually reciprocal. Both parties buy into this careful dance about not talking about the elephant in the room. The usually utterly impenetrable post-colonialist theorist Baba has a nice turn of phrase in which he refers to doubly inscribed figures faced two ways without being two-faced. And I quite like that people who engage in everyday diplomacy are engaged in socially sanctioned lying, but they're being very sincere about it. And this, I would suggest, is the stuff that allows societies to rub along, that hopefully prevents tension moving towards all-out civil war. There's also the possibility that coexistence facilitated by everyday diplomacy can morph into something more far-reaching. A key element in conflict transformation is education. Education about the self, education about the in-group, and education about the out-group. Everyday diplomacy can expose individuals and groups to the other side. It can reveal that the other side actually don't have cloven hooves and horns, that they're relatively normal people, just like the in-group. Okay. Let me conclude in a few minutes. My aim here isn't to congratulate people in conflict zones for their expert diplomacy and fortitude. I remember traveling through the former Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and to put it mildly, the place was wrecked, passing through village after village that had been ethnically cleansed. Houses burned, places of worship burned and trashed. And the curious thing about it was that everybody that I met, that I interviewed, was lovely. Everybody was immensely courteous. Everybody was entirely rational and said, yes, the war was terrible. And I left the country thinking, well, somebody wrecked the place. Someone burnt those villages, pulled the trigger, committed the sex crimes. So I don't want to congratulate people in societies emerging from violence. Instead, I want to pay attention to the skills that so-called ordinary people have, and suggest there is a bit of an imbalance, particularly from the policy and academic worlds, that we need to look a little more closely at this everyday diplomacy that has prevented the Basque Country becoming Burundi or Thailand becoming Sri Lanka. Let me make 3 points in terms of the implications of this. The first is a plea to the formalized peace-building community not to try and replicate or model everyday diplomacy. It can't be replicated. I have seen how organic, customary, traditional forms of conflict resolution have been taken by INGOs, given grants, and turned into something artificial that loses legitimacy and loses authenticity. So I think we should actually, as a peace-building community, be quite humble about the limits of what we can do to encourage this everyday diplomacy. The second implication is the traditional one that all academics say in every presentation, particularly with people who hold purse strings like deans are present, in that this needs more research. But actually, I think there is an exciting research agenda here, because we've studied the dogs that barked rather than the dogs that don't bark. What I'm interested in is the unspoken, the unacted, the unseen, the hidden transcript, rather than picking the easy research fruit that's low down on the tree. And I think particularly a lot of evaluation activity that we see in the peace-building world is simply going through the motions and picking the low fruit, the low-hanging fruit. And then my final point is just to note that a lot of the study of peace and conflict is very ahistorical. And we tend to study conflicts from year zero, from the year that the latest round of conflict began, and discount all of the rest of the conflict. But scratch the surface, and many of the societies that we're interested in, Northern Ireland, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Basque Country, Thailand, have had long periods of coexistence, ethnic coexistence, religious coexistence. And I wonder if we could learn from that. If those societies already have the lesson of conciliation and tolerance, but perhaps they need to relearn it rather than to look outside for the answers. Okay, thank you very much for your patience, particularly when I was digging myself into a hole. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Roger, for a very fascinating lecture, and I'm quite sure there are a lot of questions. When you were talking about the peace-building field, it made me think a little bit of the saying that if you only have a hammer, every single problem looks like a nail, which is something which I do think the field suffers from to a large degree. So I have a whole bunch of questions myself, but I'm going to hold those back and invite everybody, anybody from the floor who would like to ask a question. There's a mic, so don't start speaking until the mic is given to you. And I should have, when we started off, said hello to the people out there in the world, because we're live streaming this lecture as well. So I should have welcomed them to the lecture. But if you can wait for the mic so that can all be picked up. So we'll start over here. Roger, did you want to maybe stand up here?
Thanks, Roger. I found that very provocative, and I'm not quite sure yet if I think that's in a good way, because I wonder if what you've done in validating everyday diplomacy as a form of what you described as individual rationality is actually then relegate those who would call attention to latent conflict, who would be rebels or dissenters, if they then become irrational in the model that you're suggesting. And I think that that model, in fact, counteracts your argument against technocratic solutions, because I think you actually end up reinforcing some of the technocratic, perhaps even neoliberal views of what constitutes conflict and resistance.
Let's take a few, if that's okay.
We'll take a couple of questions. Anyone else?
One, two. Is it working? Roger, just thanks for your the talk there. I just wanted to ask, obviously, as somebody who grew up here, from me to you as well, obviously, you mentioned you made a comment regarding growing up and the influences upon you as an individual, and you mentioned the fact that your parents kept you away from what was going on outside. I just wanted to hear a wee bit more about that, because it's where I grew up, you couldn't avoid or ignore what was going on, and my parents told me everything, rightly or wrongly, and I just wanted to hear a wee bit about the environment, the pressures, all those various things as an individual growing up within a conflict zone, because it was live and you couldn't ignore it. So it's just a comment as well as a question there.
Thanks.
We'll take one more then in this round.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for that talk. You mentioned the state not being involved in certain conflicts. It just wasn't there.
Sorry, I wonder, could you start again? I'm not hearing.
Sorry, you mentioned that in some conflict areas, the state just doesn't really exist. And you mentioned some of the elements that are there, and you mentioned church networks in particular. But aren't churches very often connected to states, either within the country or without?
Sorry, I had great trouble hearing you. Are churches connected with?
Yeah, very often church networks belong to or are influenced by the state, but either within the country or sometimes states without the country.
Mm. Well, thank you very much for those. First question, I hope provocative in a good way, and if one can't be provocative in an academic lecture, where can one be provocative? It's quite interesting because, I mean, most of my academic work over the past decade has actually been critiquing the liberal piece. So I'm in no way recanting on that. I do hold that people are rational actors. Now, I'm not saying that, therefore, I'm adopting an econometric rational actor model. I mean that people tend to be self-interested, tend to act out of common sense, the survival incentive kicks in. I think that the model that I'm talking about actually includes a lot of room for dissent. Because in her marvelous autobiography, Christina Bielenberg talks about how rearing her children, she has a line in which she says something like cooking the dinner and putting the children to bed was an act of resistance because it kept me real. Now, I know that's a very, very gendered role, but that's what she said. And she saw that actually as a form of dissent, a form of resistance, that she wasn't, out there cheering for Hitler or gossiping with her neighbors about how great Hitler was, etc. I don't see this argument as being in any way reinforcing the liberal piece, although if I could just comment on the academic critique of the liberal piece, in my recent work I have become a little frustrated at the fact that critics of the liberal piece and supporters of the liberal piece never speak to each other. They go to separate conferences or separate panels at the same conference. they write in separate journals, and they don't actually engage with one another. And my last book has been an attempt to try and speak to both audiences while still retaining a critical perspective. And I certainly don't, I would be somewhat frightened if you interpret my argument as being one that reinforces liberalism, and particularly it reinforces neoliberalism, because certainly I think the more we look at everyday agency, then we need to look beyond subjectifying people into the compliant camp and the resistant camp. And if we subjectify them into the compliant camp, very often it's as good citizens and consumers. You know, those are good Bosnians because they're buying Coca-Cola and other products. I think that we need to look at a range of activities between that, and we need to, rather than impose our ideal types of agency on people, that we actually listen to their forms of agency that are going to be multivariate, that are going to be everything between resistance and compliance, inclusive of both simultaneously. So I see people operating in this permanent world of dissembling, and groups operating in this world of dissembling, in which they have one message for the international community: can we have more grants and reconstruction aid? Thank you very much. And to the in-group, they're suckers, let's milk them. You know, and I think we need to be real and face up that individuals and communities have this dissembling skill, I would see it as. In terms of your point, I agree completely that often conflict cannot be avoided, that it is immediate. And, you know, I didn't grow up in some bucolic cloud with fairies. You know, there were all of the usual, you know, classmates' parents being imprisoned, then in later school, a classmate being killed, all of that sort of thing, you know, the whole works. But I think parents do engage a bit like in the fiction of Santa Claus, and I'm very sorry if I spoil Christmas for anyone, but parents do engage in a series of white lies, in a series of constructing narratives, even about the death of a loved one or a pet. You know, it's a part of parenting. And I think there is a distinction between parents who exposed their children to their full political, uncensored political views, which, let's face it, in a deeply divided society might be quite extreme, and parents who act as a filter. And I think all parents, to some extent, act as filters. At the back, you raised a really important point about churches in particular, but civil society more generally, and the fact that much of civil society is actually state-sponsored, and B, state-supporting, and therefore isn't as civic or independent or plural as one would imagine, particularly from a Western liberal perspective. I think, just to expand on that point very briefly, it's important that we, I think, again, see agency in the fullest possible way. When Saddam Hussein's Iraq fell in 1993, I remember the news media said, there is no civil society in Iraq. We need to create it. I've never been to Iraq, but I could bet that there is and was a civil society there. The problem was it didn't look like our version of civil society from the global north, but there was very extensive kinship networks, family networks, mosque networks, etc. So I think that we need to keep an open mind, churches, and realize that to go into cliched territory, it's a very broad tent.